everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Earlier in the week, Roz from scallydandlingaboutthebooks and Tilly from Tilly's Shelf made a video together about their top 5 Victorian novels of the last 5 years, and this is something that's also been done by Marissa from Brontë Bookish, and Roz and Tilly tagged me to do the same thing. But I decided to combine that into a wider video that I was already planning to do about kind of my overall journey with Victorian literature, and because I hadn't read a lot of Victorian literature when I was a teenager or earlier in my 20s, my journey with Victorian literature actually isn't much longer than 5 years, so it'll be a little bit different to their video. But I really did enjoy their video and I highly recommend checking out their and Marissa's videos. So I did read some classics when I was a child. I really liked Anne of Green Gables and like The Secret Garden, but I very much like later classics. The first Victorian classic I read, until recently I didn't even realise this was Victorian. It was actually Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. I really liked that when I was a child and read it a good few times, but never really associated as being old. I haven't read it recently, but I suppose it says a lot for its accessibility as a classic when I enjoyed it so much when I was younger. From some stage between primary school and leaving cert, in the space of like 5 or 6 years, I did read Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and enjoyed them, but you know, they weren't particular favourites or anything at that stage. So the first adult Victorian book that I read was Wuthering Heights in 2011-2012 when I did my Leaving Cert. Leaving Cert is our final exams we do in school in Ireland. We study one novel. There's kind of a list of novels that teachers can pick from every year, and Wuthering Heights is on the list that year, and my teacher really liked Wuthering Heights, so she chose that for us to study. And I really did enjoy Wuthering Heights. I don't know if it's common. I know that the friends I had in the same school that had different teachers, they didn't do this, but we actually read out the entire novel in class. Like, we would take turns reading, and my teacher, I think from my memories, would read her favourite bits herself, understandably. And I really liked the story. Obviously there's just so much drama. However, here is where I have to make my strange confession for somebody that has a booktube channel now and loves reading and has always loved reading, is that English was my least favourite subject in school. How awful a thing to say. It's not the teachers I had, it's not the books we had to study. As you can tell from this channel probably, I'm just not a very analytical reader. If I'm thinking about things in books, I'm very much driven by like the emotional reaction I have to books, or like if it's just a good old adventure and I want to know what happens next. I was trying to think of the themes that we studied in Wuthering Heights. I can't really be bothered going into attic and seeing if I still have the notes, but I can't even remember the themes. It shows just how much I still think about the stuff we studied in Leaving Cert for Wuthering Heights. But just English wasn't my thing at school. In fact, the worst grade I ever got in a test ever in school was my Leaving Cert English exam. Isn't that awful? It's lucky that we don't need to use all of our subjects to get into our college courses. English didn't count for me at all. So yes, anyways, a little slice from the past. I know there's kind of a debate about whether studying books ruins them for you, and I wouldn't say that studying books ruins them for me. I just think I don't really get anything extra out of studying books in depth. And I obviously didn't have to worry about that afterwards because I did science. So that was dipping my toes into the Brontes, into the like world of Victorian literature. And I know that I definitely had owned Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre before Leaving Cert. I remember my mum buying them for me, and I know I had attempted to read them. I just didn't have the exposure to classics to keep going with them before that point. So yeah, they remained on my shelves unread until I read Wuthering Heights in Leaving Cert. So after Leaving Cert, I did a gap year where I was working full time, and then I did 4 years of a science degree. And actually, midway through my science degree I started recording what I was reading. I wasn't reading an awful lot, but I actually did start writing them down, and I have good enough records of what I read from like June 2015. But I would say that actually the genesis of my true enjoyment of Victorian literature, when I started seeing it as something that I could read outside of school, and like, you know, that I would start going to the classics section of bookshops, even to be interested in adaptations or like period drama adaptations I would see on the television, wasn't 2012 Leaving Cert. It was actually 2015. When I picked up a DVD of the Carey Mulligan adaptation of Far From the Madding Crowd, and I just really enjoyed that film, and I loved the storyline, and I loved the fact that it was set in the Victorian era, and I was like, oh, this is wonderful. I never even heard of Far From the Madding Crowd. I was just attracted by the cover of the DVD. Then I probably saw in like the opening sequence or like the end titles or something that it was based on a book, and I enjoyed it so much I actually went out and bought this very battered copy. I'd never even heard of Thomas Hardy, but I looked back on what I wrote in my book journal about this, and it says, first classic I've read since Leaving Cert, and I actually really enjoyed it. Quite funny also. So I think that says it all really. It's like, I actually really enjoyed this. It is actually a good book. You know, old books can be great. So thank you to that film for creating that perception in me. I don't know if I'd have created a BookTube channel unless I had read some classics, but yeah, you never know, I suppose. It started a lot of things. So I would like to say that after I read Far From the Madding Crowd, I was like, oh yeah, this is great, I'm going to read nothing but Victorian literature from now on. But I was, you know, still in college. When I finished college, I didn't know how to drive, so I had a very, very, very long commute and actually had no life for about a year until I passed my driving test. But in 2017 I did subscribe to my first BookTube channels, Katie from Books and Things probably being the one I watched most often, and as is inevitable when you watch Katie's channel, that little worm of Victorian literature started to enter my head, and I probably was looking at them more and more in shops, and I still wasn't reading a lot. In 2017 I read 26 books, and in 2018 I read 34 books. That's unbelievable to me now, I can't believe it. But I cannot emphasise how long my days were at work. It was awful. What I suppose is nice is when I started looking through my old emails and through my YouTube subscriptions, and this is a tool you can use to see when you subscribe to people. I'll put it in the description box because it was interesting for me. In 2019 I subscribed to a lot more BookTube channels, and I would say that's the point at which I regularly started watching a lot of BookTube channels, and that is when my reading definitely went up. I more than doubled my reading in 2019. I read 80 books in total. I obviously was influenced a lot by BookTube at that point. Although in 2018 the only Victorian classic I read was The Mayor of Casterbridge, obviously because I had enjoyed Far From the Madding Crowd so much, and I happened to find this matching edition of The Mayor of Casterbridge. I enjoyed that, but in 2019, obviously watching all that BookTube, my Victorian literature reading expanded exponentially. In 2019, it was definitely the year of Victorian literature for me, and I read 14 Victorian books, which is more than I have done so far, spoiler. And I read so many of my favourite Victorian novels still today in that year, and 3 of them are going to appear in the list later. It's definitely not a coincidence that my reading more Victorian literature coincided with my watching more BookTube, especially because I've always enjoyed the booktubers that talk about classics and make them sound so exciting and accessible, and I think that is such a big win for BookTube that it manages to do that outside an educational setting, and I was definitely influenced by it, and in time I hope I'll contribute in my own small way to that. You know, not having an English degree, not having liked English at school, that it's still possible to enjoy classics, that you can go to that area of the bookshop. It's funny how different years are for different things, but I would say 2020 is definitely like the year of Jane Austen. I'd read all of Jane Austen at some stage before, I think in 2018, but in 2019 I took what I called the Jane Austen road trip, where I actually drove over to England and saw it taught in a lot of the sites. So in 2020 I actually reread all of Jane Austen, which had an impact on my Victorian literature reading. I only read 8 Victorian literature that year, and actually no favourites that year, which probably had an impact on what books I read the next year. So I read 3 Victorian literature books the next year, 1 reread. I reread Wuthering Heights again, but that was because 2021 was definitely the year of the ship books. Someday I will reveal how many books I read that had something to do with ships in 2021. It's actually ridiculous, but I really did enjoy it, and now I know a weird amount about one specific topic, and yeah, but it definitely did distract from my Victorian literature reading. And then of course in 2022, where I joined BookTube, and the turning point for me with Victorian literature and kind of reminded me how great it was is where I reread Villette, and I started my Victorian literature project where I committed to reading at least one Victorian book per month, and that's worked out really, really well, and I've loved it. This is my first proper Victober, and I've read 3 full books already. I'm just really enjoying getting into it and watching everybody's Victober content. There's just so many more Victorian classics out there that I would like to read, and I'm definitely going to continue that project into next year, and that's next week's video, is my TBR for my Victorian literature project next year. And I've also, this year, I've had my kind of first forays into Victorian poetry and Victorian short stories, and yeah, I've just loved it. So long may it continue, and I've read 8 Victorian novels so far this year, and hopefully some more by the end of the year. So I don't think I'll surpass the year of Victorian literature 2019 yet, but maybe next year we will, we'll see. So the purpose of that little chat was to give some background to my 5 favourite Victorian books of the last 5 years. And initially when I'd done this, I'd planned to pick one Victorian classic each year for the last 5 years that I'd enjoyed. But because they were so clustered in terms of what I did read Victorian literature, it's actually 3 from 2019 and 2 from this year. So yeah, that's just the way it worked out. It's not the same kind of list as people like Roz and Tilly that have read a lot more Victorian literature in their life, but it's never too late. I wouldn't say these are in any particular order apart from the first one. So the first one, probably anybody that watches my channel can guess, is North and South. And a marker of how much I love this book is I actually read it twice in that year of Victorian literature I mentioned in 2019. I read it first time in July, and the quote from my book journal is, "A new favourite, a reread needed to see if it is one of my favourite books of all time. Romance excellent, Factory is amazing." Oh dear. But I obviously was serious about rereading it because I reread it in November, which is only 4 months later. I think I may have watched the mini-series in the middle, and that probably did influence my decision. Actually, I definitely did watch the series in the middle, because I know I was asking in every DVD shop I came across, and there are not many, even in 2019, if they had the adaptation, and I actually ended up picking it up in Bath when I went to my Jane Austen road trip in October 2019. And I actually... not only did I read it twice in 2019, but I actually read it again the next year in September, so that's less than 1 year later. So that basically sums up how much I love this book. I talked a lot about North and South in my A to Z of Victorian literature that I released last week. I just love the storyline so much. Elizabeth Gaskell's writing is so accessible. I have so many passages underlined in this book. I love Margaret Hale, the main character, and kind of Mr. Thornton, and like how they change over the novel, and all the Thorntons, as I said in my A to Z, like I just love Mrs. Thornton, and you know, the way she views things. And not to mention the Higginses, and I actually really love this edition. I love the painting on the front. I actually always imagined it as Bessie. So yeah, I love North and South so much, and I'd love to reread it again actually. So yeah, I could just never get tired of it. And that's why it's not only one of my favourite Victorian novels of the last 5 years, it's one of my favourite novels of all time, not just Victorian novels, all novels. So the second book that I'm going to talk about here is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Again, very predictable. I read this for the first time in 2019, and I reread it in 2021. I was actually surprised when I went to look back, because I think I've said several times on this channel that I've read Bleak House 3 or 4 times, and I was sure I had, but I could only find records of reading it twice, which is surprising. But anyways, I don't always get on with Dickens, but I love Bleak House, and this is the second Dickens I read after Our Mutual Friend, which I really did enjoy Our Mutual Friend, but Bleak House is just something else. I love Esther as the main character. I know a lot of people find her frustrating, but I just find her really relatable, and I think sometimes if I was living in Esther's place, I probably would make the same decisions, and I just really enjoy her for that. The ending is one of my favourite book endings of all time. The first time I absolutely just lost my mind. I was like, that is such a twist. I just loved the ending. So just the storyline and the characters, like not only Esther but also like Mr. Woodcourt, Caddy and Prince. Oh stop, they're just brilliant. I can't pretend to be a Dickens expert, and maybe I don't always go on with the comic bits of Dickens. I enjoy like Mr. Turveydrop and things when they're there. I do feel like the humour is a little bit less than other books, and yeah, I just love Bleak House so much. The entry from my first read of it was, "Definitely will be reading more Dickens in future. Understand Esther and her decisions." So the third book I'm going to talk about is Villette. As I mentioned, this was kind of a catalyst for my revival of my interest in Victorian literature this year. but I read it for the first time in 2019. And I reread it this year, as I mentioned. The note I have written down about this, and it's interesting because I was wondering whether my opinion of it had changed since last time. But the note I had written down was, actually preferred this to Jane Eyre. The love interest is interesting and the heroine had a good story in her own right. I know I'm just such an analytical reader. And I was interested when I did reread Jane Eyre this Victober whether I would prefer it than Villette. But for me, I still enjoy Villette more. And like, Jane Eyre is grand, but I just love the complexity in Villette of like Lucy, the main character, trying to make her way in Brussels, and kind of all the discussion of like mental health and like different religions, the different worlds that she's in Brussels. I just find that so entertaining. I do find the love story in this a lot better than in Jane Eyre. I just really, really liked Villette. A little interesting anecdote I had written down from my 2019 reading of this was that we were playing cards and I was reading this in between hands. It must have been near the end. Got a fierce giving out to from my dad and my uncle because they couldn't believe I was reading a book at the card table. I don't go over my old book journals much, but they really are very entertaining, I have to say. But Villette will always have a place in my heart. And I think at the moment it is my favourite Brontë book. I think it's because I just don't have an emotional tie to the other ones. I don't know if I have an emotional tie to Villette either, but like, I know a lot of people have a very special relationship with Jane Eyre, but maybe I just didn't read it when I was young enough. The last two books I'm going to talk about are actually books that I've read this year, and this one I actually read in Victober. So it is Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, and the main thing about this book is like, how is this only the third Thomas Hardy book that I've read? He's like exactly for me. It's the victorious return of Thomas Hardy. I haven't read any Thomas Hardy since I reread Far from the Madding Crowd in 2020. I've said many times on this channel that I enjoy reading about country life because I live on a farm. I just loved the descriptions of that in this, like especially the dairy and kind of the everyday work that went on in it. I actually could recognise a lot of the work that was being described from stories that my dad would say of his own childhood. Apart from that, which I suppose Thomas Hardy is very well known for his rural settings, there's also just like the complex characters. At some points in this book you actually don't really know who to root for, or maybe it's just a case that they're all so problematic, but they're all so human. Although this is such an upsetting book, and I'll go into it more in my wrap up, but it was still written so feelingly and just really affecting. The twists and turns, I could not guess what was going to happen next. I hadn't seen any adaptation. I did know kind of the first main plot point, but nothing past that. Like, in fact, when I got to that plot point, I'm like, oh, that's all the sad stuff over. No, that was not all the sad stuff over. But nevertheless, just Thomas Hardy's writing was just wonderful. And although I would still say I liked Far from the Madding Crowd more, I think that's because of the subject matter and happiness of Far from the Madding Crowd, but Tess of the D'Urbervilles I think was so perfectly written. Like, it just didn't slow down for a moment, and yeah, it was just wonderful. And the final book I'm going to talk about is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. It nearly feels weird putting this on the list because I did really, really enjoy Vanity Fair when I read it, and that's why it's on this list. But it hasn't stuck with me as much as the other books. But I think that's just because it needs a reread in typical Lisa fashion. But the things I did really enjoy about this book is like the Victorian perspective on the Regency. I obviously am very interested in the Regency period, and Jane Austen is probably my favourite author, but just like the kind of criticism of it, like there's a chapter which is one of my favourites about how to live for a year on nothing. It just is exactly what it says. Thackeray is describing how they could live by just cheating people and like accumulating debts they didn't pay and things, and just the way that was like satirized. There's like two main characters, Amelia and Becky, and they're quite different. I really like the relationship they have between them. Like, Amelia is the good girl and Becky is definitely the definitive bad girl. But just like, yeah, just kind of how their relationship changes throughout the book was just fascinating, and how your opinions can change about characters as well. Like, there's one notable example, you really don't like them at the start of the book, and then by the end of the book you're just so attached to them. It's just, yeah, I just thought that was a really skilled way to be able to change your mind completely on a character. And that's part of this book. It's like, it was just impossible to tell where the plot was going. I did love the Napoleonic Wars setting, and you really do go like right to the edge of battle. It's a long book, but the scope of the book really is so big. And yeah, finally I suppose Thackeray's like interesting way he tells the story. Like, it's really like you're walking together following the characters, and he'll like comment on what they're doing, and it's just really interesting that way. So yeah, it's definitely worth read. It is a long one, and I have heard like quite mixed reviews on it, but yeah, I definitely would like to reread it, and I know there's an ITV series that I have my eye on to watch when it comes up. So given those 5 books, I thought it was noteworthy that 2 books are from this year, and the 3 books before that are ones I've reread recently. A reread of some of the Victorian books I've read like when I just wasn't as used to Victorian literature, you know, could make them rise on the list. At the same time, those 3 books I mentioned, I did enjoy them on the first read. I just enjoyed them even more on a reread. The honourable mention would probably be Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, which, as I say, I really enjoyed, and it was actually the first Dickens book I read, but it was obviously ousted in favour of Bleak House. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little wander through my history of Victorian literature. I don't know how interesting it will be to people, but I actually enjoy hearing people's reading stories and how they differ. But for myself, I would love to read more Victorian literature in particular. Can't wait to sit down and like finalise the 12 books I want to read next year, as well as I will hope to read more than 12, but the 12 I want to read anyways. But yeah, thanks for Roz and Tilly on this idea how to like flesh out this video and make it more interesting. I would love to hear below what your journey with Victorian literature was. Did you like studying literature in school? What's your favourite Victorian classic? And yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.